Greetings, nerds, and welcome to this three-part series on the French Revolution. So far in class, we have covered the longer-term causes of the French Revolution, like the political, social, economic, and intellectual causes. Hopefully, you're thinking of specificity right now. This three-part series is actually going to get into the revolution. So in this first part, I'm going to cover kind of like the lead up to the revolution, what's going on with the Estates General, the voting, etc. The second part will cover the National Assembly, the first government of the French Revolution, and the third part will cover the National Convention and the Directory, and then eventually Napoleon overthrows the whole shebang. So here we go. So this slide here essentially sums up the financial crisis in France in the 1780s. Basically, that debt that's been created since Louis XIV from his wars, Louis XV, the 7 Years' War, aiding the United States during the American Revolution, it's all coming into this perfect storm in the 1780s, and basically their country is going to experience economic collapse. Their tax system isn't going to fix it because it places the burden of taxation on the third estate. Essentially, the bourgeoisie can pay, and very few other people can. Then you combine the economic issues then with agricultural failures. So the late 1780s, like 1787, 1788, were two of the hottest summers in French history, which led to drought, which led to poor harvests of wheat, which then leads to significantly higher bread prices, which ultimately leads to starvation. You put all those together, you have a perfect storm of economic problems to create the French Revolution. All right, quick little digression here. So I took this photograph a few years ago. So at Cornell, fun fact, actually has the largest collection of French Revolution artifacts in the world outside of France. And I brought my students for like a tour of their French Revolution archives, and they actually have Marquis de Lafayette's sword in their collection. And they just like let people like touch it and play with it. It's fantastic. So that's me with Marquis de Lafayette's sword, the one of the important members of the French Revolution. It's so cool. I totally nerded out. Anyways, here we go. So this chart is going to show you just how expensive bread gets in 1787, 1788. And looking at 50% to 80% of someone's income being spent on just bread alone, that is unsustainable. If you can't feed your families, you will overthrow your government. I can tell you, if you ever like have a conversation with your parents about how much they spend on food for your family, I can guarantee you it's nowhere close to 80% because that's unsustainable, it's unlivable. But that's the effect of poor harvests in France in the late 1780s. Okay, next. So one of my pet peeves is when students say Louis XVI did nothing to prevent the French Revolution or to fix the tax system. He actually did. It's just he's going to experience an issue every single time. So there were a series of reformers to the tax system, and the most important ones being Calonne and Turgot here. And they basically, especially Calonne's reform, essentially said you must have an equitable tax system. Tax the entire population of France. Don't have these exemptions, and then you might be able to slowly pull France out of this spiraling debt. All right, so Louis like, okay, let's see how this goes. So he brings that proposal of taxing everybody to the second estate, the nobility. And the nobility are like, okay, well, we'll take the tax, but guess what? We want to be compensated with political power. And you know how the king is now going to respond to that. That's where he puts his foot down. He says no. So basically, it's this idea of exchanging taxation privileges for political power, and that's what the stalemate is. So that's where they really can't get past, and that ultimately means they're not going to actually create real change. Okay, so now that France's government is on a standstill, the nobility of France forced Louis XVI to actually reconvene its parliament, the Estates General. So when they are being reconvened, they first, since it has been reconvened in 175 years, literally no one alive has been present to like figure out how to do it. They actually had to study these really old books and figure out just how to actually vote, things like that. And what they decided to do is Louis told the three estates, okay, elect your representatives for each of the estates, and then also collect grievances, or cahiers de doléances in French. And basically all the issues you have with the French government are now being collected by each of the three estates. So you can imagine what the third estate's grievances are going to be, the second estate's grievances are going to be, and maybe for the first estate, but we don't really care about them at the moment. And when it came down to voting, that's where the main issue is. So historically, the Estates General would vote by chamber, not by head or person. So basically, when you vote by head, it means each representative gets one vote. But that's not what the Estates General did. They voted by chamber. So the entirety of the first estate gets one vote. The entirety of the second estate gets another vote. And the entirety of the third estate gets a vote. So the third estate, they wanted to vote by person, by head. But the first and second estate overruled them, and they decided to keep the traditional system of voting by chamber. So let's imagine how this works. So here's the three estates in the Estates General, and how many representatives they have. And yeah, the third estate does have double the representatives, but they still are voting by chamber, by each estate. So for example, let's say the law is create a taxation system where everybody gets taxed. How would the first estate vote? No. How would the second estate vote? No. How would the third estate vote? Yes. That's 2-1. The vote doesn't pass. So what the third estate quickly realized is even though the Estates General has been convened, they can't actually create reform because the voting system prevents it. Oops. Okay. So the continuing issue of the nobility wanting to reform by getting more political power for themselves, that's going to continue there. So the author of the other popular Euro textbook, History of the Modern World, R.R. Palmer, makes a great argument that it truly was the nobility of France who started the French Revolution, not the bourgeoisie or other members of the Third Estate. But what we're going to find is that the Third Estate very quickly is going to surpass the Second Estate in its importance and its power during the French Revolution. Okay. So then we start seeing some defections in the first and second estate. So some members of the first estate, the clergy, and some members of the second estate, the nobility, they start kind of seeing, like they have political foresight. They start seeing the writing on the wall that the third estate's 97% of the population, and they are seething with anger right now. And they start switching sides. A famous example from the first estate is a Catholic clergyman, Abbé Sieyès, who writes a pamphlet called What is the Third Estate? And look at these arguments he's making about the clergy and the nobility. He's calling his own social class dead weight. Dang. His pamphlet has this powerful call and response. What is the third estate? Everything. What has it been until now? Nothing. What does it ask? To be something. They want political power. So now we're starting to see these defections, and the writing is on the wall. So now that the Estates General has met, they start seeing the third estate is meeting, everyone is meeting separately. So the first estate met in one chamber in one part of Versailles, second estate meets somewhere else, third estate met somewhere else, and the third estate hated that. So they demanded that they all meet together in one room, a massive auditorium, and call themselves the National Assembly because they make up the entire nation, not separately. So a very famous member, probably the most famous member of the Second Estate, started sitting with the Third Estate. He ignored his own estate and sat with the Third Estate in a show of solidarity. Super smart move on his part, because he was literally the richest man in France after the king. And he eventually does survive the French Revolution. Marquis de Lafayette's a fascinating human being in history. Obviously, he was the main supporter of the Americans during the American Revolution. So keep your eye on this guy, because he has done some really cool things later on. All right, so the Third Estate is ticked off. They officially rename themselves the National Assembly. The First and Second Estate flip out, and the Second Estate demanded that the king close the meeting hall for the Third Estate, and the king gave in. So the king orders his troops to close the meeting hall of the Third Estate. So the Third Estate go to their hall. Oh, darn, it's locked. What should we do? Oh, I don't know. Let's go find a place in Versailles that's big enough to hold the entire 600 representatives of the Third Estate. So they just went to the nearest place that could hold 600 people, and that happened to be an indoor tennis court where they're going to take an oath. And in this tennis court oath, June 1789, the Third Estate, which has now called itself the National Assembly, is going to pledge never to disband until they have written a new constitution for France. And so the other key part is what they have effectively done here is they have declared themselves completely sovereign of the entire French government. So they technically are not being controlled by the king and not the other estates. They are considering themselves separate. They consider themselves the legitimate government of France now. Obviously, the king is going to disagree, and so are the second and first estates. But that is this move. It's a hugely it's probably the first major symbolic move of the French Revolution. Gotta know the tennis court oath. So how does Louis respond? Well, he calls in the troops. That's an oops. So 18,000 troops for 600 representatives. He calls 18,000 troops to shut this down. So what this does is it basically is the last straw for the bourgeoisie. Historically, since Louis XIII and XIV, the bourgeoisie have been in the camp of the king because they have gotten significant political powers using the Intendant system. But when the king has called in the troops here, that was it. They have lost all support for the king, and now you have the bourgeoisie 100% in the revolution. So here's a famous sketch from a neoclassical artist named Jacques-Louis David. David, definitely know him. He was not only a radical member of the National Convention, but he was also a fantastic painter. He eventually becomes the personal court painter to Napoleon. He's got some really impressive stuff. So he's the one who did the portrait of Napoleon crossing the Alps on his horse. But he also makes this sketch of the tennis court, and yes, this is indeed the tennis court. Okay, let's see. Let's do some skipping here. Next, the true official beginning of the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille. So the Bastille is this medieval prison in the heart of Paris. It's huge. And the Bastille historically has been a prison, but recently, in about the last 50 years, it really became a prison for, like, political opponents, and mostly, like, genteel, like, well-to-do political opponents. And what started happening is the Bastille really became a symbol for everything like the urban working class, the sans-culottes, hated about the monarchy. And they would walk by the Bastille every day, and they would just look at the Bastille and just seethe with anger. It just represents tyranny and despotism. And in July of 1789, the revolutionaries are starting to arm themselves. So that morning, on July 14th, the revolutionaries invaded another famous part of Paris called Les Invalides, which is a very famous building, and they started gaining weapons. But they didn't have enough gunpowder. And they're like, wait, we need gunpowder. What keeps a lot of gunpowder? Oh, the prison right in the middle of Paris has a lot of gunpowder. And additionally, that morning, the king ordered the cannons on top of the Bastille to be pointed directly at the most revolutionary, like, neighborhood quarter in Paris. Like, he's just asking for it at this point. So the revolutionaries make a huge mob, and they start tearing down the front gate and eventually the entire building of the Bastille. They take out the guards, they kill some of the guards, they take the commandant of the prison out, and they execute him in the streets by beating him to death. So on July 14th, 1789, this is officially the beginning of the French Revolution. This is also the France is today, they're like equivalent of Independence Day. So if you go to France on July 14th, it's basically, fireworks everywhere. So here's the importance of the storming of the Bastille. I didn't say anything about the bourgeoisie here. This was all of the lower classes, like the sans-culottes, have now taken an active role in the French Revolution. That's key. All right, you can give that a read if you want a little more information on storming of the Bastille. And same thing. This is actually a really cool one. It talks about the importance of the National Guard, and Marquis de Lafayette eventually commands this new National Guard that eventually became really the military of the French Revolution. And they create the new colors of France, red and blue and white. So eventually they create a new flag called the tricolor, and it's based on what Lafayette created for a flag for his soldiers. There you go. All right. So, on that note, I'm going to end part one here, and then we will get to part two very shortly. Thanks for listening.